Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to give a contribution on this appropriations debate. And, I think that we should hark back on what the leadership recently of that national government recently said when asked what legacy they would like to leave. I understand that it was a group of young people who asked the Prime Minister what he would like to be remembered for. And his response was something along the lines of, I would like to be remembered for my management of the economy. Not a particularly inspirational response, but look, if that's what he chooses to be measured on, then let's measure him on that alone. Now, of course, the national government and national parties generally like to ride on the assumption that they are good, sound economic managers. And it is an assumption, Mr. Speaker, because when you drill down into the legacy that that government has left, it is not nearly as rosy as they would like to present. Think, for instance, of the fact that we have $56 billion in additional debt since National took office. $56 billion. Now, it's easy when you bandy about numbers like that to lose sight of the impact that that is having on the economy and future taxpayers. But that is equivalent of New Zealanders having to pay $10 million a day in interest. That is astounding. And that is debt that we took on to fund things like that government's tax breaks, which went predominantly to the top income earners in New Zealand. That is what the rest of New Zealand is paying for. But if the government wants to be, if the Prime Minister and that government wants to be judged on their economic record, then let's look specifically then at this last budget. Let's look beyond debt. Let's look at their claim that they have moved the government books into surplus. An admirable goal, Mr. Speaker, if it's real. But this government's surplus is a surplus on paper. How did they achieve their surplus on paper? Well, they kept ACC levies higher than they needed to. In fact, $120 million higher than they needed to. That essentially means that New Zealand taxpayers have provided the funding for that government to be able to say that they have a surplus. What was the second thing they did? Well, they put up on the books that the $375 million in NZTA spending was not spending, but a zero-interest loan. That was the second measure. And the third, perhaps the most cynical of them all, was that they spent $560 million less on the Canterbury rebuild in this budget than they did in the last budget. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the surplus delivered by that government. Hardly sound economic stuff, but that is how they got the books to look a little more rosy. But what does that all mean for individual New Zealanders, for individual taxpayers? Because that's what's important. Well, I think David Parker probably summed it up best when at the Labour Congress recently he said, what's the point of a rockstar economy that doesn't pay the roadies? And that essentially is the difference between Labour and National. We both strive for budget surpluses. In fact, Labour had 9 real ones under their belt when we left office. But it matters to us how we get there. And it matters to us what point sound economic growth serves. Who is benefiting from the economic prosperity that we deliver as governments? And that is where you'll see a difference between Labour and National. We don't believe in growth for growth's sake. We believe in growth that benefits people. And at the moment, we're not seeing that. Mr. Speaker, what is the point of a surplus when housing ownership is at a 50-year low? When first-time home buyers and people of my generation do not fundamentally believe that they will ever own their own home. They do not believe that there is any hope for them in that regard. And Jonathan Young shakes his head. All that tells me is he hasn't had a conversation with a young person from Auckland in a very, very long time. But that is the reality. House prices, and I would expect the member who lives in Auckland to perhaps be slightly better versed on this issue. Housing prices in Auckland are up $200,000 on average since National took office. 200,000. That is absolutely astounding, and that is why my generation believes they're being locked out of what was always perceived to be almost a rite of passage in this country. Mr. Speaker, what point is a budget surplus if inequality is reaching record highs? We hit that in 2011, and as much as that government we can easily prove it. It's called the Household Income Survey, and it tells us that actually we are still reaching high points. If you average it out, all it tells you is actually we're just as bad as we've always been. Nothing is getting better. We might not have reached some of the high points that we'd seen in previous decades, but it's still high. It's hard to celebrate something that's just as equally awful as it was the past 3 years. Inequality is not something to be celebrated, and it is not something we can deny. New Zealanders know it exists. And try telling a New Zealander that we're in surplus and everything is fine, when, for instance, they're amongst the 46% of New Zealanders who didn't get a pay rise last year, but you can almost guarantee that they've felt the impact of rising housing costs. Their rent's gone up, or they can't afford to even save to get into their first home. And what point, Mr. Speaker, is a budget surplus and a rockstar economy if you still have 260,000 children in poverty? And as we pointed out in the House today, 2 out of 5 of those families are in work. I absolutely resent the fact that the government continues to try and portray poverty as an issue that happens to other people who almost deserve it because they're on benefits. Poverty happens to sole parents, to people struggling to find work, to families who are in work. And it is not good enough to say, well, it's just because we've got low wages, but that's the necessary evil of employment. This side of the House believes we can strive for full employment, and we can have full employment and decent wages at the same time. Mr. Speaker, what point is a booming economy if it doesn't benefit people? And as I've said, that is the difference between them and us. And that is why our economic agenda for growth and prosperity is around 3 key themes. The first is housing. We still believe in the old mantra that everybody needs something to do, someone to love, somewhere to live and something to hope for. And the somewhere to live is becoming dire. A capital gains tax not only addresses the issue around supply, it also addresses the fact that we at the moment have a tax system that simply isn't fair. And if that side of the House continue, I cannot believe that they continue to treat a capital gains tax like an alien thing. 2 countries in the OECD don't have them, and if you want to hold yourself up against Switzerland and Turkey, be my guest. Kiwi Build is the second thing we'll do, but Mr. Speaker, work, the principle on which this party was founded, continues to be a cornerstone of what we will campaign on this election. We want to get unemployment down to 4% in the first 3 years, but ultimately we believe everyone should have the dignity of a decent paying job, one that allows them to put food on the table. And with our plans around regional economic development in particular, we believe we can do that. And finally, families, Mr. Speaker. Best Start was just the beginning for us. We have an agenda that says we actually believe that parents should be able to still hold on to that mantra and that hope that their children will be better off than even they were. At the moment, we're on a decline. We can reverse it, but all it needs and all it requires is a vision from a government who knows that GDP, your trade deficit, your surplus, none of those measures matter unless your ultimate focus is on improving the economy for people. And that is why Labour deserves to be in government after the next election.
Good speech.
I call Simon O'Connor.
I love it today as we hear from opposition MPs talking so negatively.